What really happened to Davy Crockett at the Alamo? And why did one hard morning split into two rival endings? Tonight, we'll trace the whole road. Mexico's power shift, Texas on edge, the mission's weak walls, the siege clock that ran out, and the final rush at dawn. Along the way, you'll see how rumors, records, and pride turned a man into a legend. Stick around to discover which version best fits the ground, the tactics, and the times, because the answer hides in the details we're about to uncover. Part 1. Why Texas exploded, from federalism to Santa Anna's central rule. How did a change in Mexico City turn a quiet mission in San Antonio into a powder keg by 1835? Let's roll back the clock. In 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain. The new nation faced a hard map, huge land, thin money, and few soldiers. Texas sat far from the capital, with more bison than banks. To hold the frontier, Mexican leaders tried a simple plan: invite settlers, boost trade, and keep the peace with local militias. They offered land to families who would work it and swear loyalty. Many came from the United States. They brought plows, rifles, and church on Sunday. For a time, it worked. The plan had rules. Mexico banned the import of slaves in 1829, but allowed some exceptions and slow steps. It asked settlers to follow Mexican law, use Spanish in courts, and join the militias. On paper, the system looked tidy. On the ground, it was messy. Courts were far away. Roads were bad. Indian raids struck hard. Local leaders had to improvise. When a ranger patrol chased raiders, no one waited for stamps and seals. They just wrote. Here's the key frame: Mexico's 1824 Constitution. It set up a federal system. States had real power. Think of it as a bundle of small fires warming a big house. Local control kept the rooms from going cold. Texas was paired with Coahuila as one state. The bargain was simple: follow broad national rules, but run most daily affairs at home. That idea fit the frontier mind. People who cleared their own fields liked to run their own towns. Then the weather changed. By the early 1830s, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna rose to the top. He first talked like a federalist. Many cheered. But power is a strong drink. Soon he flipped and pushed a central plan. He scrapped the old balance and pulled authority to the center. States lost their guardrails. Governors were replaced. Local militias faced doubt. The big fire in the house got larger, but the small fires began to die. Texas felt the chill first. Settlers saw new soldiers and new taxes, but no new help. The 1830 law of April 6 tried to halt most immigration from the United States and tighten customs. Smuggling became a game. So did evasion. Small disputes turned sharp. The Anahuac disturbances flared. Arrests, protests, and standoffs followed. Even men who wanted to stay loyal worried that the rules kept changing. Folks can work with a tough rule. They can't work with a moving target. Meanwhile, the frontier kept bleeding. Comanche and other tribes raided for horses and goods. Towns begged for troops and supplies. Mexico City, short on cash, sent orders instead of wagons. Local leaders leaned on each other. They called meetings and wrote letters. The talk was plain: give us the old federal system back. Let us repair our walls and pay our men. We'll handle our end if you let us. That was the tone across many towns, not just in Texas. You can spot a pattern when even quiet men start clearing their throats. Now bring in San Antonio de Bejar and the mission we call El Alamo. It wasn't a fortress from a storybook. It was a church complex with thick but low walls, long barracks, and a worn chapel. Good for storing food and gunpowder. Not great against trained infantry and heavy guns. Yet its position mattered. The road network funneled through Bejar. Control that node and you steer the region. Lose it and the door swings wide. In late 1835, local and volunteer forces fought the Mexican garrison at Bejar and took the town. It was a sharp, close fight, house to house. The victors held the mission as a handy depot and symbol. They patched walls, mounted cannons, and waited. Winter winds cut through the gaps. Food ran thin. Still, morale rose when flags flew and bands played. The defenders thought help would come if needed. After all, what army would sprint across miles of bad road in winter? Santa Anna, that's who. He loved speed and shock. He marched north in early 1836 with a large force. He wore bright uniforms and liked big shows. He also liked discipline. When he raised a red flag at San Antonio, The message was old and clear, no quarter. Some say he wanted to crush the revolt before spring and scare others into silence. If you act fast, you can make fear do half your work. That was his bet. Inside the Alamo, men read Travis's letters calling for aid. Couriers dashed out through the dark. Volunteers trickled in. A few turned back. Time felt like a tide pulling outward. The garrison knew the place was hard to hold. The walls were long. The men were few. The cannons needed powder and trained crews. But leaving meant giving up the symbol. And symbols, especially in a young fight, can be stronger than stone. Hold the crossroads, hold the cause. That was the simple math. Here's an irony worth noting. The Alamo stood for local resolve, the old federal spirit, in a land ruled from far away. Yet the mission's very weakness forced the defenders to trust each other more than their maps. They had to stretch thin lines, move guns by hand, and learn new roles overnight. One day you were a hunter. The next day, you were a gunner. The day after, you stood guard on a wall built to keep sheep, not soldiers. Later in this video, we'll walk the assault hour by hour. But first, keep the bigger frame in mind. The fight at the Alamo was not a random brawl. It grew from a clash over who should rule daily life, the far capital or the near community. Santa Anna chose the center. Texas leaned toward the states. When the center crushed the old arrangement, trust broke, and the frontier lit up. So, how did a change in Mexico City turn a quiet mission in San Antonio into a powder keg by 1835? By stripping power from the states, shifting rules without steady support, and pushing a hard central hand into a rough, distant land. That mix turned El Alamo from a mission into a mark on the map, a place both sides felt they had to hold, not for its walls, but for what it said. Next, we'll zoom in on one man who walked into that storm. Davy Crockett. How a famous Tennessean lost a seat in Washington, packed his rifle, and headed for Texas. Part 2. Who Davy Crockett was before Texas, and why he left Tennessee. What could make a famous Tennessean leave his home, his friends, and his old career to gamble everything at a worn-out mission in a far-off land? To answer that, we need to meet the man before the legend. David Crockett was not born in fine clothes. He grew up on the edge of the woods, where a good shot and a steady hand kept food on the table. As a boy, he learned to track, to trade, and to talk plain. He missed some school, but he didn't miss much else. Hard work will teach you things a book can't. By the time he was a young man, he could read a trail, read a room, and read a man's face. Later in this video, you'll see how those simple skills mattered inside the Alamo's walls. Crockett served in local militias and got his first taste of public duty. He wasn't polished. He didn't try to be. He rose because people trusted him. He could fix a fence, shoot a hog, and settle a quarrel without a judge. In a frontier town, that's a resume. When he ran for the Tennessee legislature, he didn't hide behind big words. He stood in the mud with the voters and said what he meant. Folks like that. They sent him to Nashville, then later to Washington. Now, here's where the road bends. In Washington, Crockett met the machine. Parties, deals, and long speeches filled the days. He did not care for fine society rules. He kept his plain style and plain talk. Some loved him for it. Some didn't. He often stood apart from the party line when he thought it hurt his people back home. That independence won fans in the backwoods and enemies in back rooms. We'll connect this attitude to the Alamo later, because going your own way can be brave and costly. Crockett's fame grew, sometimes faster than the facts. Plays were written. Pamphlets and tall tales spread. He became a figure, not just a man. That helped him win attention, but it made targets too. When you're a symbol, every vote becomes a headline. In Congress, he spoke out when he thought a measure was wrong for his district or wrong in principle. He wasn't always careful with the feelings of party bosses. He thought a man should answer to his neighbors first. That plays well on a stump. It plays poorly in a caucus. Back in Tennessee, politics turned rough. New lines were drawn. New faces rose. Crockett's critics said he liked the spotlight more than the grind. His friends said he was the only honest one in the room. Both sides worked hard. The election of 1835 was a knife fight with smiles. Crockett lost. The results stung. He was not old, but in public life, your last result is your age. He looked out at the hills he knew and saw doors closing. Now, men at that fork take one of two paths. They settle down, tell stories, and run a store. Or they look for a new frontier. Crockett chose the second. He had family to think about and pride to protect. He also had a streak of adventure that didn't fit a porch. Texas called to that streak. Land, freedom, and a chance to start fresh. Those words weigh more when you've just had the wind knocked out of you. He told his neighbors he would head west. A famous line is tied to that moment. However it was said, the meaning was clear. If home won't have me, I'll make a new one. Why Texas and why then? Timing matters. By late 1835, Texas was already hot. Volunteers were heading there with rifles and hopes. Reports said the land was rich and the cause was just. Mexico's central rule felt heavy on distant towns, and local men wanted the older system back. Crockett saw a fight that matched his nature, local folks standing their ground. He had disagreed with central power before. Now he would put his boots where his mouth had been. He also knew his strengths. He was a hunter, a marksman, and a man who could keep people's spirits up. On a cold wall, that matters. He had a name that could gather men and a laugh that could calm them. He was not a master of maps, but he understood courage and the value of being seen. The Alamo needed both, powder for the guns and heart for the long wait. Crockett could bring heart by the wagon load. Later in this video, when we walk the siege, remember that morale is a weapon. He carried it like a rifle. The road to Texas was not lined with pillows. Travel was hard. Money was tight. He told stories along the way and drew small crowds. Some say he planned to take land and settle if the smoke cleared. Others say he meant to fight first, talk later. Both can be true. A man can want a farm and still pick up a musket when trouble comes. When he reached San Antonio, he found a town on edge, soldiers drilling, and a mission trying to become a fort. The walls were low. The men were brave. It was exactly the kind of place a stubborn soul would choose. Here's a small irony. Crockett had been punished for not bowing to party chiefs. In Texas, that stubbornness became a virtue. The Alamo needed men who wouldn't fold when the crowd ran thin. He joined the garrison and signed on. He didn't come as a general or a grand planner. He came as a volunteer among volunteers. In a way, that was the point. Texas was a place where a man's worth came from what he did today, not what he wore yesterday. Stick around to discover how his personal habits, early rising, steady aim, quick wit, fit the daily grind of a siege. These small details explain why some later believed he died fighting to the last, and why others thought he might have been spared and then killed. Personality leaks into legend. We'll trace that line soon. So, what could make a famous Tennessean leave home and risk it all at a broken mission? Pride after a bitter loss, hunger for a fresh start, and a cause that matched his backbone. He left because Tennessee politics shut the door and Texas cracked a window. Through that gap, he saw land to work, friends to help, and a stand worth making. That is how a former congressman became a volunteer in a cold-walled mission. Next, we'll step through the Alamo itself, its layout, its guns, its thin line of men, and see why the fight they faced was baked into the bricks long before dawn ever broke. Part 3. The Alamo itself. Walls, guns, men, and a fort that wasn't. What kind of fight was baked into the bricks of the Alamo long before the first trumpet sounded? Start with the truth most stories skip. The Alamo was a mission, not a purpose-built fortress. Its walls were thick but low. Some were crumbling. The 4-acre compound wrapped around a courtyard with long barracks on the west and the chapel to the east. A wooden palisade, basically a stout fence, closed the gap between the church and the low wall. Strong enough to stop a rush? Maybe. Strong enough to stop trained infantry with ladders and bayonets, backed by cannon? That's a taller order. Look at the ground. The north wall was the longest and least improved. The south ran along the old mission's face, with a main gate that needed attention. The west wall hugged the old convento and rooms that became barracks. The chapel stood like a stubby anchor on the east, more symbol than strong point until engineers added a few firing positions. Inside, the defenders dragged artillery into place. An 18-pounder on the southwest corner, smaller guns spaced along the walls, a couple of pieces looking down the palisade. Think of it as a patchwork of local fixes under constant time pressure. Now to the men. The garrison mixed regulars, militia, and volunteers. They were brave and stubborn, but thin on trained artillery crews. Some could fire a cannon. Fewer could manage powder, fuses, angles, and recoil under stress. Muskets and rifles filled the gaps. Rifles, like the long pieces many Tennesseans carried, were accurate but slow to reload and poor with bayonets. Mexican infantry came with smoothbore muskets that reloaded fast and worked well with cold steel. In a wall fight, rate of fire and bayonets start to matter more than long-range accuracy. What about the enemy's doctrine? The Mexican army was not a mob. It had officers trained in European methods, columns advancing under drum and bugle, skirmishers out front, ladders and scaling parties ready, reserves behind. Artillery pounded walls to shake defenders and keep heads down. Once a breach opened, or a weak spot was found, infantry rushed, threw up ladders, and pressed with bayonets. Against a low wall, that system is deadly, especially when the defenders can't match artillery practice shot for shot. Santa Anna brought numbers and speed. He liked shock. He also liked ceremony. The red flag raised in San Antonio signaled no quarter, an old sign for a hard war. Whether every man agreed with it or not, the message tightened spines on both sides. Inside the Alamo, that meant one thing: fight hard now, because bargaining later may not exist. Outside, it meant officers had to deliver a quick, visible win to make the threat stick. The clock itself became a weapon. Let's walk the defensive logic. With long walls and few men, you can do one of two things. You can stack your best shots at likely breach points and hope to race to trouble spots. Or you can spread thin everywhere and pray the line holds. The Alamo tried a blend. The 18-pounder at the southwest could bark across open ground and discourage massing troops. Smaller pieces along the north and east could throw canister, tin shells loaded with iron balls, at close range. Rifles looked for officers, drummers, and laddermen. If the enemy reached the wall, defenders tried to shove ladders back, fire down the rungs, and countercharge through doors behind the parapet. But there's the rub. The mission's tall interior rooms made odd firing angles. Some walls offered little cover to reload. The parapets weren't uniform, and the banquettes, those raised steps behind a parapet, were makeshift. Moving a gun even 10 yards took a detail of sweating men, not a quick order. The defender's best asset was local grit. Men willing to hustle from one hot corner to the next with powder, shot, or a steady joke to keep nerves from fraying. Let's talk weather and time. The siege lasted nearly 2 weeks. In that space, Mexican artillery pounded and probed. Batteries crept closer. Drums and bugles sounded at odd hours to disrupt sleep. Sharpshooters picked at anyone who showed a hat over the wall. Inside, repairs fought a losing race. A battered gate patched at midnight might shake loose by morning. A cannon carriage split could sideline a key gun until someone found timber and rope. Every fix cost strength, and every hour made the next hour harder. Weapons quality shows up next. Rifles from the frontier could hit well beyond musket range when there was light, calm air, and a clear shot. Siege mornings seldom offer that luxury. Smoke hangs. Light fades at the worst moment. Targets blur into gray coats and black hats. At 20 yards, accuracy matters less than volume and steel. Mexican troops trained for the bayonet. They drilled to climb, stab, and keep going. The Alamo's low walls were a poor place to receive a bayonet rush without grenadiers or deep reserves. Could the walls have been improved enough to change the end? Engineers added earthworks, raised a few breastworks, and sank gun platforms. Good work, but time was short. The north wall remained vulnerable. The palisade, while useful, was still wood. The chapel, for all its bravado in art and memory, was not a fort keep with thick bastions. It was a solid shell with small firing points. If the enemy got inside the courtyard in numbers, rooms and doorways would turn into a maze of short, brutal fights. Manpower sealed the math. A few hundred men can't stand a 4-acre perimeter without quick reserves. Once defenders start shuttling from breach to breach, gaps open behind them. That invites a flanking rush inside the compound. Picture a hearth catching in 3 corners at once. You can throw water on the first flame. You might smother the second. The third takes the house. That's how large force assaults win against thin lines, by making too many now problems to solve in one breath. They are batteries for human will. Later in this video, when we sort the final claims about who fell where, keep in mind how morale holds a line 1 minute longer than odds allow. So what kind of fight did the Alamo promise from the first? Not a long, clean duel of artillery. Not a silent siege where thirst forced surrender. It promised a short, violent storm once the attackers massed, with breaches on the weakest faces, ladders slamming, canister roaring, and then room-to-room combat inside a mission that was never meant for war. The ground, the walls, the weapons, and the numbers all pointed to a final rush at dawn, when cold and fatigue cut deepest. And that is the answer we held to the end. The Alamo's very design fixed the script. A mission with long, low walls, few trained gunners, thin reserves, and a determined enemy trained for the bayonet yields one likely outcome: a fast, furious assault that breaks in, spreads, and decides the matter in minutes, not days. Next, we'll win the siege clock itself, Travis's letters, Fannon's hesitation, Houston's calculus, and ask the hard question: if relief had arrived, which part of this script could it have rewritten? Part 4. The siege clock, Travis's letters, Fannon's delay, and Houston's calculus. If relief had reached the Alamo in time, what, exactly, would it have changed? Start with the clock, because clocks don't lie. Santa Anna reached San Antonio fast in late February 1836. He moved men like a gambler pushes chips, confident and quick. Inside the Alamo, Lieutenant Colonel William B. Travis understood what speed meant. He wrote for help at once. His letters were plain, firm, and sharp as a bugle. He called for all Americans in the world to come. That wasn't poetry, it was math. Long walls, few men, and an army outside equals send bodies now. Couriers slipped out at night, riding hard on cold roads. Those men deserve a word here. They were the thread keeping the Alamo tied to the rest of Texas. Without them, the garrison is just a lonely island. With them, the Alamo becomes a bell that keeps ringing. Later in this video, when we walk the dawn assault, remember the couriers. They didn't fight on the wall, but they fought the clock. And sometimes that is the bigger enemy. Who could answer Travis? The obvious name was James Fannin at Goliad. He had men, muskets, and some artillery. On paper, he looked like the one who could move. But paper isn't a road. Fannin faced broken wagons, balky oxen, thin supplies, and mixed signals. He tried to start and turned back. Critics later said he hesitated. Supporters said he was prudent. Both can be true if your guns lack carriages and your food is low. Marching out half-ready to meet a larger force can turn relief into ruin. Still, for the men at the Alamo, every hour of delay felt like a door closing. What about Sam Houston? He carried the broader strategy of the young revolt. He needed an army that could live to fight, not die for a headline. He saw the Alamo's weaknesses and the speed of Santa Anna's move. He sent orders to remove artillery and abandon San Antonio before it was too late. By the time those orders mattered, it was already too late. That's the sting of frontier command. Lines of authority run slower than horses, and sometimes a brave garrison chooses to stay when the plan says go. Houston did not want a last stand in a mission. He wanted time to train, time to gather, time to pick the ground. Time is a general's best friend. Zoom out to the settlements. Volunteers were coming, but in knots and dribbles. Men had farms to mind and families to move. News traveled by rumor and letter, not by wire. A call for help on Tuesday might not reach a camp until Saturday, and a march that should take 2 days could take 5 when wagons broke or cold rain turned roads into glue. Texas was big, and the Alamo sat in a pocket far from easy aid. Every mile stretched the thread Travis had thrown. Inside the mission, the defenders managed hope like they managed powder, carefully. Every rider who slipped in with a handful of volunteers lifted spirits. Every day, without a clear column on the horizon, pressed those spirits back down. Crockett, Bowie, and others worked the morale line. Jokes, songs, steady talk. That matters when you're rationing sleep and counting shots. But even the best morale can't move a column that never left. Let's test a simple what-if. Suppose Fannin had gotten his train in order and set out early with a few hundred men and some guns. Could he have broken through? Maybe, if he moved fast, kept supply tight, and caught the Mexican outposts by surprise. But Santa Anna was not idle. He sent out pickets, set batteries, and kept a net around the town. A relief force would have had to fight through the net, then sprint into a fortified city already under artillery fire. That is a tall order for green troops on bad roads. Even success might have meant joining the siege, not ending it. Another what if. What if Houston had been closer with a corps of trained men? then the logic changes. A compact, drilled force can hit a flank, blow through light screens, and break into town before dawn. But Houston was building that force while the Alamo stood. Training days are the coins you spend for victory later. He chose to save those coins for a field of his own choosing. Men who call that caution forget the parade that followed at San Jacinto. You can lose a mission and win a war if you keep your army alive. Now consider politics, the quiet pressure behind every decision. The Alamo had become a symbol. Travis's letters were printed and read aloud. A stand there said, "Texas will not bend." Leaders knew symbols pull men to the colors. But symbols can also chain you to a bad position. Once the Alamo became a banner, the idea of leaving felt like betrayal. So the defenders stayed, the enemy ring tightened, and the clock kept ticking forward, never back. Supply lines finished the picture. Ammunition, food, and animals decide how far and how fast relief can move. The Mexican army, for all its issues, had momentum and interior lines around San Antonio. The Texian side had distance and disorder. Wagons break, mules die, and men get sick. None of that makes for stirring headlines, but it makes for hard outcomes. If you've ever tried to fix a fence with the wrong nails, you know the feeling. You can want to finish, but the hardware won't let you. Here's the part folks miss. Even if a relief column had reached the Alamo's walls, the mission's shape still dictated the endgame. Long, low parapets, thin reserves, and skilled attackers with ladders lead to the same kind of fight: short, violent, and close. Reinforcements might have added minutes, maybe an hour, perhaps even a breakout. But to change the script, relief had to be early and strong, not late and equal. You don't fix a leaky boat by pouring in another bucket of water. You need timber and time. Stick around to discover how this ticking clock pressure shaped the exact sequence of the final morning. The hour you launch an assault and the hour your defenders are most tired are not accidents. They are choices. Santa Anna chose dawn for a reason. The defenders had done the best they could with the nights they had. Part 5, Dawn Assault, House to House, Reconstructing the Final Battle. How did the March 6th assault actually unfold? And what does that tight timeline suggest about where Davy Crockett most likely moved inside the Alamo? Before the first trumpet, the night did its work. Cold air, little sleep, and nerves made hands stiff and eyes slow. Mexican batteries had pounded for days, knocking chips from parapets and shaking doors. Inside the mission, the men knew dawn was the danger hour. It always is. That is when sentries blink a little longer and powder horns feel heavier. Keep that in mind as we step minute by minute, because later in this video, we'll compare each step with the places Crockett might have stood. Santa Anna planned a 4-column attack. Trained companies formed in the dark, drums hushed, ladders shouldered. Skirmishers crept first to soak up fire and find weak angles. Behind them came tight blocks of infantry, bayonets fixed, officers trying to hold silence together with hand signs. No one loves climbing a wall into cannon and rifles, but doctrine is doctrine. Ladders, speed, and weight win these fights, especially against low parapets. Inside the Alamo, the men waited behind uneven walls. The north face was long and thin, the east anchored by the chapel, the west lined by barracks, the south cut by the main gate. An 18-pounder sat on the southwest corner like a bull ready to snort. Smaller guns were scattered where the carpenters could keep them upright. Many defenders were riflemen, deadly at distance, slower at close range. Few were trained gunners. That mattered the second the first bugle call sliced the dark. The opening rush hit the north first. Ladders banged, men shouted, and canister tore lanes through the leading files. Canister is a cruel tool, a tin can packed with iron balls that turns a cannon into a giant shotgun. At 20 yards, it doesn't argue. It ends arguments. The first waves recoiled, tangled in their own ladders, then tried again. Officers pushed with swords, and drummers beat the cadence that says, "Don't stop now." On the parapet, defenders shoved rungs back and fired down the rails. A few ladders stuck. That's when the balance shifted. 1 bayonet over the top becomes 5. 5 becomes 20. While the north boiled, attackers on the east pressed toward the palisade that linked the chapel to the main wall. Wooden barriers can slow men. They cannot stop momentum. Once the first men jammed in close, muskets tilted up and fired blindly at the parapet. Splinters flew. A brave defender can only lean so far over a log fence before the next volley slaps him back. At the same time, a push along the west wall tested doors and windows into the long barracks. If a door cracks, the fight flips from wall defense to room brawling in seconds. Now to the south. The gate area had been patched and watched. It was not the softest point, but it wasn't a fortress gate either. Under pressure from several sides, any hinge can become a weak spot. Smoke thickened. Commands turned to shouts. Inside, runners carried powder bags, spare flints, and a few rough jokes to keep men steady. If you've ever tried to thread a needle with cold fingers, you understand a loader's nightmare on a dawn wall. As the north face finally broke, the attackers spilled onto the parapet and jumped down into the compound. This is the pivot. A wall fight is one thing. A courtyard fight is another. Once inside, columns split into files, hugging walls and racing to doorways. Defenders tried to form interior lines, shifting men from quiet sectors to hot corners. That shuffling saved minutes, not hours. The ground plan worked against them. Long, straight fronts, few bends to create crossfire, and too many doors opening into rooms with poor fields of fire. The barracks turned into a string of small battles. Smoke and dust filled tight spaces. Musket flashes lit faces at arm's length. Bayonets and clubbed muskets did work bullets couldn't. In that chaos, courage counts, but drills win. A trained file enters a room low, left, right, thrust, move. Volunteers learn that on the job, and the job rarely teaches gently. What about the chapel? It drew eyes then and draws eyes now. As a symbol, it is strong. As a keep, it is only fair. Some defenders fell back toward it, using its thick front wall and side rooms for cover. The facade, famous in art, offered little actual firepower. Once attackers had the courtyard, the chapel became a pocket to contain, not a castle to break. Grenadiers could clear at last with concentrated fire and measured steps. So where does Crockett fit in this storm? We can't pin him to one brick with certainty, but we can test likely rolls. He was a marksman and, by all accounts, a steady spirit. That makes him useful on a wall just before contact and very useful where morale wants to crack, say, along the palisade or at a threatened gate. He was not a trained artillery captain, so picture him near riflemen rather than strapped to a gun carriage. When the north face buckled, a man like Crockett would be sent, or would run, toward the loudest danger to help hold a line or guide a fallback. Consider movement paths. From the west barracks to the palisade is a short sprint across open ground with little cover. From the palisade to the chapel porch is another short dash. If he started on the west or north parapets, the easiest retreat under pressure aimed toward the long rooms or the church wall, places where defenders felt the stone at their backs and could try to make a last pocket. That's not romance. That's instinct in a compound that offers few good corners. Minutes, not hours, decided everything. Once multiple ladders topped the north and pressure bent the east, interior positions collapsed in sequence. Runners became fighters. Fighters became a knot of men making stands in doorways. Mexican officers, seeing success, fed reserves into the breaches to keep the wave from stalling. The red flag promise of no quarter, whatever each soldier believed, pushed the pace on both sides. If you think there is no mercy ahead, you don't waste breath. You shoot, swing, and step. Pause on one detail. Music. Drums and bugles didn't stop when the wall fell. They kept order in the storm. That rhythm pulled companies through smoke and told men where the next push lay. Against that metronome, defenders had only shouts and memory. Who covers this door? Which room has a loophole? Who has powder left? In such a maze, even brave men lose the thread. Later in this video, we'll weigh the rival claims about Crockett's death. But the assault sequence already narrows the options. A man devoted to steadying others is rarely found in a quiet corner. He is at a weak fence, a failing step, or a doorway that must not fall yet. That is where songs stop and hard choices start. How did the March 6th assault actually unfold? And what does that tight timeline suggest about Crockett's likely movements? Saved until now, the attack cracked the north first, pressed the east, and flooded the interior, turning the fight into short, savage room battles. In that pattern, a seasoned rifleman and morale builder most likely moved along the west to palisade to chapel axis or held a contested doorway near the barracks. where his voice could stiffen a wavering line and his shot could buy seconds. Seconds were all the Alamo had left. Part 6. Aftermath and Myth. Execution Claim versus Last Stand Legend. What really happened to Davy Crockett after the Alamo fell? Did he die fighting to the last, or was he taken alive and killed after the battle? First, the smoke. On March 6, 1836, the fight ended fast. Fires smoldered in rooms. The courtyard was a wreck of broken ladders, spent canister, and torn gear. Mexican officers had to count the living, guard the town, and move on. The Alamo was never meant to be a tomb, but now it felt like one. Later in this video, we'll link these first choices: clean up, burn, march, to why the record is so thin and so hard to nail down. Post-battle practice in that era was blunt. You removed weapons, searched bodies, and cleared the ground. Reports say many defenders were burned in large pyres near the mission, not buried in marked graves. That is why we don't have a neat headstone for Crockett. No carved date, no quiet plot, just a place on the map where the air once smelled of smoke. When later generations went looking for where he fell, they found arguments instead of proof. That silence fed the legend, because a missing grave is like an empty frame. People will paint their own picture. Now to the stories. In the days and years after the battle, two versions of Crockett's end spread. The first said he died in the fight, rifle in hand, courage unbroken. It matched the mood of Texas and the tone of his life. A stubborn man on a hard wall, standing fast. Survivors from inside the town, like Susanna Dickinson, shared what they saw and heard, though none claimed to watch Crockett's last breath with their own eyes. Joe, Travis's enslaved man, spoke about the battle's chaos and the dead he saw. Their accounts painted the day, but did not anchor Crockett to one spot in the final minute. The second version said Crockett was captured alive with a small group, then executed by order after the fight. This line drew on Mexican sources that surfaced later, most famously a manuscript tied to José Enrique de la Pena. In it, the writer describes several prisoners, one said to be Crockett, brought before officers and put to death. Over time, the manuscript's path and parts were questioned and tested. Ink, paper, handwriting, and history all took their turns in the ring. Some scholars defended it. Others called it flawed or a mix of notes and later edits. The debate did not end, because the paper trail did not close the case. Before we weigh them, let's add back the Alamo itself. We just walked the assault. The north face cracked first. The east pressed. The courtyard filled with attackers. Barracks turned into short, brutal fights. In that pattern, where would Crockett most likely be? As a steady rifleman and a man who could stiffen a wavering line, he would be near the worst trouble: palisade, north breach, or a hot doorway. Those places were not kind to captives. When a wall breaks and bayonets lead, mercy is rare and fast choices rule. That doesn't make capture impossible. It makes it less likely in the first rush. Still, the claim of capture points to a moment after the main fight, when pockets were trapped and the last shots were done. Could a few men have been cornered in a room or by a wall and forced to yield? Yes. Could an officer have decided, in anger or by standing orders, to have them killed? Also yes. Santa Anna had raised a no-quarter flag before the battle. Whether every officer agreed or obeyed in full, the tone was set. If prisoners were taken, they stood on thin ice. Why does the died fighting story grip the American mind so tightly? Because it fits the man and the cause. Crockett had been the plain-spoken fighter in Congress. He had lost an election for sticking to his line. He went to Texas to start fresh and help men who wanted local say over their lives. A last stand ties the bow on that life. It is clean, brave, and easy to tell a child. The execution story is harder. It makes him a victim, not a captain of his end. It also asks listeners to accept that enemies sometimes keep better records than friends, and that pride may shape what we want to hear. Let's talk records. Mexican Army paperwork after a fast victory can be thin or lost. Some officers wrote later, with memories changed by time and politics. On the Texian side, most witnesses inside the walls were dead. That left a handful of civilians and messengers. Newspapers took what they had and filled gaps with tone. In the 1830s, mail routes were slow and editors liked strong lines. A fell fighting headline travels well. A captured and executed line can sound like a stain, even if it is true. Editors knew which story rallied men to the flag. Then there is the burn question. If bodies were burned in piles, personal proof, buckles, knives, hats, melted or mingled, later diggers could not say, "Here he rests." That loss of a fixed place keeps the argument alive. When you can't point to dirt, you point to words. And words, once they leave a man's mouth, grow wings. What about motive? Ask who gains from each version. Texian leaders and U.S. newspapers had reason to seed a brave, simple tale that would stir volunteers and donors. Mexican officers had reason to claim control and order after a bloody morning, and to show that enemies who killed their men paid a price. Neither side had reason to write a dull, gray truth. That is the hard part of history. The truth is often gray. People like black and white. Could both stories hold a piece of the truth? Picture this. Crockett fights through the first breach, falls back with a knot of men, ends up in a room or by a wall with no exit, out of powder, out of time. He surrenders or is taken down, hurt but alive. Officers argue. A few want mercy. Others point to the red flag and the day's losses. The decision is made. Shots or blades do the rest. That scene would let both sides hold onto what they need, bravery and control. It also matches the speed of the cleanup and the lack of a grave. But a warning, could be is not was. We owe the man plain dealing. We do not know. We can match the tactics, read the accounts, and test the tone, but we cannot tie him to 1 square yard at 1 second. When someone says they know, ask them how. If the answer is a single source written years later by a man with a stake in the story, be careful. If the answer is only, "It sounds right," be careful again. So where does that leave us? With a narrow lane between pride and proof. The battlefield pattern makes a death in the fight more probable than a neat capture on the open wall. The no-quarter signal and later Mexican writings make an execution of any captives plausible. The missing grave keeps certainty out of reach. The early newspapers and public mood pushed the last stand legend into the lead, where it still runs. The De La Pena line, whether pure or mixed, keeps tugging on the story from the side. Stick around for our wrap at the very end of this video, where we pull one last thread through all 6 parts. For now, let's close the loop we opened. What really happened to Davy Crockett after the Alamo fell? Did he die fighting to the last, or was he taken alive and killed after the battle? The most honest answer, save for now. The ground, the tactics, and the first rush make a final stand the likelier path. The climate of no quarter and a few later accounts keep the execution claim possible. Between them stands a man whose life, plain, stubborn, and brave, fits the first story best, even if the second can't be ruled out.